Introduction to Human Resources Management, Chapter 12, Establishing a Pay Structure. As we noted in Chapter 11, people view their position and their pay as a reflection of their status. Pay is a powerful tool for meeting an organization's goals, and it is an expensive part of the costs of a company, and it can range anywhere from 5% to 40% of revenues, depending on how reliant a company is on physical employees to achieve their mission. When making decisions about pay, HR should take a look at the job structure, which is the relative pay for different jobs within the organization, the pay structure, which is pay policy resulting from a job structure and pay level decisions. So you look at the entire organization. Are we going to be on the high end? Are we going to be low end? Are we going to be industry average? The job structure, we try and determine the pay that's appropriate in accordance with all of the jobs that we've identified. The pay level is the amount that we pay for a particular job within the job structure. Things to consider when developing a pay structure for an organization: you have legal requirements. You have to have equal pay for equal work. There are minimum wage requirements. That also pertains to overtime pay, and there are restrictions on child labor. You also have to look at the market forces. We talked about forecasting, surpluses, and shortages of labor demand and supply. Market forces also play into it. The product markets refer to all of the companies providing goods and services in the industry. The labor market is all of the people that these firms would have to hire, so they may be competing for the same people in order to produce the same or competing products and services. The organizational goals: you could have a high-quality workforce strategy where you hire the best and the most qualified and pay them the most. You could have a low-cost quality. You could be going for lower-level people because that satisfies the requirements for your strategy in order to achieve your mission. Cost control, making sure that you're not paying too much if you don't need to in order to maintain profitability. Obviously, you want to be looking at equity and fairness, as we discussed before, as well as legal compliance. When you look at the legal requirements, the market forces, and the organizational goals, they all go into the pay level decisions, job structure decisions, and pay structure decisions. That goes to pay rates, pay grades, pay ranges, and pay differentials, which we will talk about in upcoming slides. Equal employment opportunity, that statute that we covered in chapter 4. Employees cannot base differences in pay on age, sex, race, or any other protected status. So if you are doing work in one particular field, any other employee with a similar level of expertise and experience should be making the same pay. There's no guarantee of equal pay for men and women, white minorities, or any other group, because it really is based on the work that's being done. If you have a man and a woman, the woman has more experience, performs at a higher level, and has greater education. It's okay, even if they have the same job, for one person, in this case the woman, to be paid more than the man. The differences cannot be simply because of their gender differences, however. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 was a new law that reflected what happened to an actual person named Lilly Ledbetter. In Canvas, I believe I have a video up there that you can take a look at where they interview her. She had been working at Goodyear, I believe in Alabama, and had the same job as several other men in a management capacity. The men were making much more money than she was, and unfortunately for her, there is a complaint that you could file through the EEOC, but the way the law had been written, you could only submit a complaint when you found out that there was a problem. Her pay had been different for many years, and when she filed the complaint, they basically made the argument that she should have known that she was being paid less, and it was outside of what is called the statute of limitations. In the legal world, a statute of limitations, it's not actually a statute, it may be part of a statute, but it is a time limit. So if you have a complaint, let's say you have 6 months or a year or 3 years to file a complaint. If you wait too long, then you can't file that complaint, even if it was valid. In her case, she found out about it. She only had 180 days to file the complaint, but she really didn't have any way to make that determination. She kind of got stuck between a rock and a hard place. She didn't know that she wasn't making less, and when she did, because she had been making less before, she didn't have the proper avenue through the law to be able to file a complaint. What the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act did, aside from making sure and reinforcing issues of fair pay, it stated that if you have a pay disparity every time you get a paycheck, that is a renewal of the statute of limitations. So if you have 180 days to file that complaint, every time you get paid less than someone else, you can then have the grounds to file that complaint. So if that law had been in effect when Lilly Ledbetter wanted to file the complaint, she would have been able to and get the recourse that she was seeking. So as noted, 2 employees on the same job can make different amounts within whatever the pay range and the pay grade is, because it can be based on experience, skills, and seniority, but it cannot be based on things like age, gender, national origin, or any other protected class. Minimum wage is a law that requires people who are working by an hourly pay that they receive at least a minimum amount. It is established by the federal government and by the state governments as well. At the federal level, it is $7.25, and that has not increased for several years. It has not kept up with the rate of inflation, and for that reason, many states have increased their minimum wage. In Massachusetts, it's at least $15, which is more than twice as much what the federal minimum wage is, because it's intended to reflect the cost of living in Massachusetts. It tends to be a much more expensive place to live. It's a more expensive place to work, and the minimum wage in Massachusetts is going to be higher than what the federal minimum wage was. If you remember when we talked about law, states can provide greater protection or greater benefits than the federal government, but they cannot provide less. So in this case, even though the federal government has said that the current minimum wage is $7.25, Massachusetts is able to exceed that for people who live in Massachusetts. They would not be able to go in and say the minimum wage is $6 because that would be in conflict with the federal law, and the federal law is supreme. The Supremacy Clause only addresses issues where states are diminishing rights or benefits under federal law. So in this case, Massachusetts having a higher rate is perfectly fine. A standard work week is considered to be 40 hours per week, so overtime is when employees work in excess of 40 hours a week. Now, if you are a non-exempt employee, meaning that you are not a manager, you are a regular hourly wage earner, and you work more than 40 hours per week, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, employers have to pay time and a half, 1.5 times the usual rate of overtime hours. So if you're making $30 an hour, the first 40 hours that you work there, you make $30 an hour. If you work 10 hours of overtime, you would get $45 an hour because half of 30 is 15, and you would get time and a half. So you get your regular time plus one half added to it. Exempt employees do not qualify to get overtime pay. These are your managers, outside staff. They're not covered by the FLSA. They're usually on salary. I'm a manager. I'm on salary. I make a certain amount per year. I have to work as much time as I need to work to get the job done. The next slide shows how to compute overtime pay. There's a little bit of a twist here that doesn't come up often, but it is included in the calculation here, and that is if you receive a bonus. In this example, the employee is getting $15 an hour. They also get $40 a week as a bonus for showing up. So if they show up on time and they get their $40 on top of it. If you had a regular work week, you would make $15 an hour times 40 hours. You'd get $600 a week plus your $40 bonus. You make $640 on average a week. In this case, though, the employee worked 50 hours. So there's 40 hours of regular work and 10 hours of overtime. You have to calculate the overtime rate, which, as we know, is 1.5 times the regular pay. In this case, however, it's $15 an hour. That $40 bonus that they get is also pay that they're getting. So you have to consider that in this example when you calculate it out. So you look at the regular pay, which is $640 a week, which is $640 divided by 40. That comes out to be $16 an hour. So even though they're making $15 an hour, because they get that bonus, that is their regular work pay. So it is $16 an hour in effect. When you're looking at paying this person overtime, you don't do it on the $15 an hour they're making. You do it on their effective weekly pay, which is $16 an hour. 16 times 1.5 is $24 an hour. So their overtime pay for the 10 hours they worked over 40 is $240 on top of the $640 that they usually make, and you end up with $880. Again, this is an example that doesn't come up often. Usually it's a lot easier because you don't get that $40 bonus. Ordinarily, it would be $15 an hour, and you would do time and a half on the basis of that, which would be an additional $750. FLSA restricts the use of child labor. It's said that in the last 100 years, there didn't used to be childhood until a lot of labor laws came into being, because in the old days when there was a lot more manufacturing, there was less service jobs, children often started entering the workforce at the age of 14, 13, sometimes even 10 and 11, going back into the late 1800s. Under statutes that exist, you cannot work if you're under 14. If you're 14 to 15, you can only work outside mandated school hours, and you can only work in non-hazardous jobs and for limited amounts of time. If you're 16 and 17, you can work a little bit more time, but you cannot work employment in hazardous jobs. There are exceptions for some of these age requirements, including babysitting, acting, and delivering newspapers. The federal government happens to be the biggest employer in the United States. They're also probably the largest contractor of third-party employees in the United States. So what the government can do on its own, it does, and it has millions of employees. But what the government doesn't do on its own, it hires companies to build things for it or to provide services for it. Because they hire so many people by contract, we have a prevailing wage law. So if you are a federal contractor and you are working in one area as opposed to another, you have to pay the prevailing wages where you are doing that work. So if you're a Kansas company with a headquarters in Kansas where the cost of living is much lower than it would be in Boston, but you received a federal contract, you have to pay the prevailing wage in Massachusetts, not Kansas. That is to protect the wages for the people who work in a particular geographic region. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 covers construction contractors if you make more than $2,000 in federal contracts, and the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act of 1936 covers all government contractors receiving $10,000 or more in federal funds. So there are a lot of requirements and conditions that can be applicable to people who are doing work with the federal government, even if they do not work directly for the federal government. And because the federal government is such a large employer, many others start doing the same thing for their employees. If I have to do certain things because the federal contract that I have requires it, then I will just treat my employees as if they were federal employees as well in order to comply with the requirements. So even though I'm a private employer, because I have a federal contract, I do have an incentive to treat my employees as if they were federal employees too, and to comply with all of the federal requirements that I'm going to be facing. Pay ratio reporting is something that was required from a couple of acts that came out recently. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act after the last recession came out around 2010. Companies now have to report the ratio of their chief executive officer's pay when they compare it to a median employee. CEOs have been making a lot of money, and the amount of money that they make has increased dramatically over the last 50 to 60 years. It used to be that your average CEO would make 20 or 30 times what the employee was making back in the 50s and 60s. Now it's not that uncommon for them to make hundreds of times more than the regular employee, sometimes even thousands of times more than what the regular average or median employee would make. Keep in mind, average is mean and median is right in the middle. So we're talking about the median employee. If you added up everybody's pay for an entire organization, the one right in the middle is the median. If you average them all up, if you added all of the salaries together and divided by the number of employees, that's the mean. That typically skews higher because people who make more money at the top could skew the average up higher. We're not talking about average here, we're talking about median. This was intended to give people a better sense of how much their CEOs are making. It didn't used to have to be reported, but now it is a requirement. And it's a way to give transparency so that employees of a company know how much their senior managers and the CEO specifically are making. We talked a little bit about product markets and labor markets. A product market consists of all the organizations that are offering goods and services in a particular area or an industry. These organizations will compete on quality, service, and price, and the cost of labor happens to be a big piece of that because it is an expense. So if I have high labor expenses, the cost of my products and services are going to be high as well. The labor markets is when we're talking about these same organizations competing for the human resources that they have to be able to fulfill their obligations under their mission. Because these companies are in competition, they are all trying to keep their costs down in order to get the cheapest products, so they are also trying to pay the lowest rate that would be reasonable. This can be influenced by the cost of living, which is sometimes tracked by the Consumer Price Index. This is what the federal government looks at to determine the rate of inflation. Consumer Price Index is basically a market basket of goods and services. So the government will look and see how much a gallon of milk costs, a gallon of gas, a loaf of bread, a car, etc. They figure out what it costs in the year 2018, and then they look at it in 2019 and see if they got more expensive or less expensive. If it got more expensive, they will determine what the CPI calculating factor was, and that is basically the rate of inflation. So as inflation continues to progress, if you get 2 or 3% of inflation every year, if you don't pay your employees 2 or 3% more each year, you're essentially giving them a pay cut. Because if you have $1 today and it's 5% inflation, that means you need $1.05 in order to be able to buy the same thing, to have the same purchasing power that you did the year before. So if your pay does not keep up with inflation, your employees are losing money. They're not getting as much money or as much value that they did before. So companies should keep that in mind, that the rate of inflation can put pressure on salaries. So how do companies determine how much they should pay their employees? A lot of it depends on what the competition is paying their employees. You don't want to lose employees to your competitors because they're paying more, but you also don't want to pay more than they are. You're not going to be losing people to another company, and if they're not getting any benefit for that, you're really just driving up the cost of your products and services if you overpay. One thing that you can do is gather information. Benchmarking is the process of comparing your company to other companies. It's not necessarily the easiest information to get because your competitors are probably not going to be all that forthcoming about telling you how much money they pay their employees. However, you can do pay surveys, you can ask people, you can go to consultants. The federal government has the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a very key agency in terms of providing information to the industries about things like pay, job descriptions, and the like. The Society for Human Resource Management, HRM, has information about it. There are also, as I said, consulting firms that can collect this information, and for a fee, you can get access to this information to help you determine the appropriate rates of pay. Things to consider when you're talking about fairness or equity in pay. The equity theory is that employees will judge fairness in different ways. You have external equity and internal equity. External equity is when I compare what I'm making to what people are making in similar jobs in other companies. Internal equity is when I compare my pay to my coworkers. How an employee views this information can vary amongst employees because whether or not you're being treated fairly very often comes down to a subjective determination. So some employees may think that they're being paid fairly. Others who are actually being paid less may think that they're also being paid fairly. It kind of depends on the perceptions of your employee and as an individual. The next graphic just shows pay equity. If pay seems fair, my outputs and inputs are equal to someone else's outputs and inputs, meaning the amount of work that I'm doing and the amount that I get paid is similar to what someone else is doing and what they're getting paid. And if they balance out, then it's fair. If I'm putting out more, if I'm working harder, I'm more productive, but I'm getting paid less than others, then I could view that as being unequal or unfair. And because it would be perceived to me to be an inequitable pay structure, I may become dissatisfied and have issue with that. If employees feel that they're not being paid equitably, they may put forth less effort. They may find a way to increase their outcomes. They could work less. They could steal supplies from the company. They may also go to job withdrawal, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. They may not want to stay with the organization, or they don't do as much work as you would like them to do. It's important, as we mentioned before, that employees have access to information, so HR should communicate information about employee pay, not by violating their privacy. You don't necessarily want to tell everybody how much everybody's making, but you do want to make sure that whatever the job bands are, whatever the pay grades are, whatever the rates are, the ways that we determine job performance and any raises or promotions that are given, all of that should be clear so that all of the employees know what the rules are, and you should apply them appropriately so that they can feel that it's equitable. Employees can always get information about what other people are making through websites like Glassdoor, Indeed, and Salary.com, because whether or not you're making that information public, they will go, usually anonymously, and say that they work for your company and whatever your job title is and how much money they're making, and other people will do that too. And they will definitely go out there and start to compare. So the level of transparency that you can provide, you should. Details about the individual pay on their own paycheck. You can provide market data to show how you made decisions about how much people should be paid. Pay planning and strategy. You should be able to explain how the decisions are made, as we said, in accordance with your policies and procedures. And we should have a full disclosure of how much we pay for particular jobs and job classes. We want to do an assessment of the relative value of the jobs that we have because not all jobs are created equally. Some jobs may be more important and we may value them more, therefore they get paid more. Some jobs may require higher levels of pay even if we don't necessarily determine that it's important for the company, but the industry demands or the economy demands that people who get those jobs are paid a certain level. You can do a job evaluation where you measure the internal worth of the jobs that are in there. You look at all of the compensable factors, what makes it important, and then you rate those jobs according to the importance of the job factor to determine how much money they should be paid. Some of the compensable factors that you can look at, even within particular job structures, are employee experience, employee education, how complicated the work is that they're doing, what kind of working conditions that they have, and how much responsibility do they have. Usually managers make more money because they're more responsible for things other than line workers who have less responsibility. The next chart shows what it could look like if you've mapped out these compensable factors on this hypothetical job structure. You've got computer operators, computer programmers, and systems analysts. The complexity and the level of the job is probably going to be in order. Computer operators don't need as much experience as a computer programmer. Computer programmers have more experience than a computer operator. Systems analysts will have more experience and more capability than a computer programmer. Computer programmer is likely a higher level job than a computer operator. So when you're looking at it for the experience, for the first two jobs, they're about the same, but you need more experience to be a systems analyst. For education, the least experience is a computer operator. The middle level, or roughly mid-level, is computer programmer. You need the most to be a systems analyst. The complexity of the job follows similarly. And then when you add these up, you get the compensable factors. So when you have a systems analyst, you know that that job is going to be more important. There's more experience required. There's more education required. It's a more complicated job. It's probably more important to you. Therefore, you will likely pay more money for it. You will also identify key jobs, the things that you really need to have done that are important for the organization to achieve its mission. Key jobs are relatively stable content, and they're common among many organizations, so it's not just your job. You could have an accounting department, you could have a marketing department, you could have a customer service department. Your competitors probably have the same type of departments as well, but they're key jobs, and you can collect benchmark data on these because these are the type of jobs that are usually replicated from other companies in the industry. So how do you determine the pay structure? Some of the things that you can look at is the hourly wage. These are non-exempt employees, so overtime rules apply to them, and you pay them a certain amount by how many hours they work. So for each hour worked, they receive a certain amount per hour. Piecework rate is usually something that's more of an incentive rate, and it translates well to manufacturing jobs. So if I'm putting together something, you could pay me by how many completed items I have at the end of my shift. If you think that it's a good idea to do 20, you could pay me $50 for each one that I build. So at the end of my shift, I get $1,000. Salary is simply a rate of pay that you get per month or per year. You would be an exempt employee, so therefore overtime does not apply for you. So if you get $100,000 a year, you may work 40 hours a week, you may work 60 hours a week, depending on what needs to get done. So for pay rates, the rates of key jobs can be based on the survey data that you collect. Non-key jobs often don't have much data available, so you have to figure out how to plot this information on a graph, which we'll get to in a couple of slides. The pay policy line on the graph that we're going to show you shows the relationship between job evaluation points and pay rates. So here's the pay policy line. When you take everybody, it's kind of like a scatter chart, so employee A through N. You list them based on how many job evaluation points, how important that job is, how much experience are required to have that job. And then on the other axis, you've got the monthly salary. So employee A is in a job that has the least amount of job evaluation points. Not surprisingly, they make a commensurate amount, a lower amount. When you go all the way up to N, they're actually a little bit outside the pay rate there. They have the most requirement here. It's a little bit below 320 or right around 320, and they're making about $6,500 per month. In the midline there, that means that you have pretty accurate data points because the data points are pretty close to that midline. If they were scattered all over the place, you would probably need to review how you're doing your pay grades here and your pay policy. But this is just an example that you would typically have predicted salary and monthly salary and evaluation points all come together to show the scale. The more important the job, the more highly these jobs have evaluated in terms of the evaluation points, the more likely they are to get a higher level of pay. Pay grade is a series of jobs that have similar worth or content and they're grouped together. You could have different pay grades for different jobs if they happen to be commensurate in terms of how you've rated them. They may not match the market rate because the market rate may not reflect what you think is important for your particular organization. The pay ranges are the pay rates defined by minimum, maximum, and midpoint for each grade. So you could have a pay grade of $65,000 to $80,000 a year that attaches to a particular job type. You could make anywhere from $65,000 to $80,000, depending on how many years you've been in the job, how well you perform, etc. The flexibility by having these pay grades can let you bring in people with less experience and pay more for people with more experience while keeping them in that same job bundle. Now, if you have a red circle rate, that means that you fall above the pay range for the job, and I'll show you where those might be in a moment. A green circle rate is when you fall below. So pay above what you would expect, that gets a red circle. Pay below is a green circle. The next slide here shows the sample pay grade structure. So you've got A and B in one, you've got C and F in another, G and I, etc. They're all in these different pay grades. And you've got the job evaluation points. That's the defining rate for where you're going to put that pay grade. So from 110 to 150, you've got about 2,000 to 2,750. If you're in a job that goes from 150 to roughly 200, you'd make between 2,500 and 4,000, etc. A green circle rate would be L, for example, because L could be making anywhere in that tan-colored box, but they're a little bit below the median line. That means they're making a little less than you could expect them to pay, while K is making a little bit more. K would be a red circle, L would be a green circle. A pay differential is when you pay somebody a different amount because of conditions or labor markets. If you are working on an hourly rate, and nobody wants to work overnight, typically nobody wants to work on holidays, you may have a differential where you pay people more to work on a holiday or overnight shifts. If you're in a hospital, you work 7 to 3, 3 to 11, and 11 to 7. 7 to 3 may be the daytime cost. Minimum wage, it's $15 an hour. Evenings from 3 to 11, you may pay people $16 an hour. You may pay people $17.50 if they work overnight. The difference in pay would be a difference in the amount that they're getting paid because the hours are different. You could also be in Boston as opposed to another branch that you may have in Topeka, Kansas. You might not make as much money in Topeka because the cost of living there is not as much. If you work in Boston, you may get a differential to compensate for the fact that it's more expensive to live here. One of the trends that's been happening in job-based pay is to delayer. So you create these job grades and pay structures. Delayering is to reduce the number of levels to give more flexibility in terms of how much money you can pay people. So you put more assignments into a single layer called a broad band, as opposed to these pay grades where they're more distinct. So instead of having 5 or 6 pay grades, you could have 2 or 3 broad bands. That means that you give more emphasis on getting people experience rather than promotions. Skill-based pay systems really looks to pay people based on what they are capable of doing because they have higher levels of skill and knowledge or they have greater technology capabilities. If you have a particular job that requires you to do more things, you have to get a certification for some type of technical requirement, you may get paid more money because of that. I worked at an organization where we had a skill-based pay system for people who had IT capabilities. Even though the job was very similar to other jobs that didn't require that certification, we could give them more pay because it was something that we needed to get, and in order to attract people, we had to pay more money for it. So we had a skill-based system where they were allowed to get a higher rate of pay because of their qualifications. When we talk about the red circles and the green circles, it's so that the compa ratio analysis that we're going to do here will make sense. Compa ratio is a comparative analysis when you compare one person's job pay to another person's job pay when they're in the same grade. Because depending on the experience that you have, the amount of time that you've been working, the performance that you've had, you could be in one job grade, but people could be making different amounts of money. If you make the average midpoint of your job grade, your compa ratio will equal 1. If you make more than the midpoint, you will make more than 1. If you make less than the midpoint, it will be a fraction of 1. The way to calculate a compa ratio is you look at a pay grade. Here we have 4 employees in a pay grade 1. The midpoint of that pay grade is $21.75. 3 of the 4 employees actually make a little bit more than that. Employee number 2 makes a little bit less. So when you look at the compa ratio, you get the average of all of these employees and you compare it to the midpoint. And we know that the employees for that job grade or that pay grade are 1.07. They are all making a little bit above what the midpoint of that job pay grade is. If you were to chart these employees out on a compa ratio, you would have the midline. That would be the 21.75. Employee 1, 3, and 4 would be above that. They would be red circle rate. And the employees below that would be green circle rates. Or the employee number 2 only would be a green circle rate. That means if you're going to give raises on the basis of cost of living, you may want to give a bigger bump to the employee who's below the midpoint and smaller raises to those who are above to be able to make sure that they maintain relative levels of equity within that pay grade. Pay during military duty, if you leave to go to a deployment, when you come back, you should be getting the same job or the same amount that you were getting paid before, or at least comparable to that. We also talked about pay for executives. Pay for executives does lean on equity theory a little bit. We talked about the transparency that is required by the Dodd-Frank Act. Many employees are finding out how much their bosses are making, and they're not particularly happy about it. There are a couple of videos that I've posted in Canvas about employee pay compared to CEO pay, so I'd like you to take a look at those as well. When you look at CEO pay at the 100 largest U.S. companies, most of them get paid in stock and stock options. These are things that we'll go over when we get to the benefit and pay chapters. Why do CEOs not get paid salary? Well, part of the reason is income tax is much higher than stock tax. If you get stock and you make money on stock, you pay capital gains, which is about 15%. If you get income and you're in the top income bracket, you may be paying about 37%. So a lot of CEOs don't want to make income. In fact, many of them don't get any, or they get $1 in terms of salary. So you want to get most of your money, if you're a CEO, for tax reasons in the form of stock and stock options. Bonuses are also a way to give incentives. We'll have a chapter on that later on for all employees, but a lot of them also make bonuses. Salary is the smallest cohort. And that wraps up Chapter 12.